It's the early 1940s, and Europe is engulfed in World War II. Still reeling from the First World War, the United States stays out, arguing that the conflict has nothing to do with it. But the theatre of war has already reached Asia, and one mapmaker has realised that it is an imminent threat. Hard at work, he's desperate to shake his fellow Americans out of their cartographic lethargy. Every line of his pen is a visual argument, every shade of ink boldly persuasive. He creates dozens of maps, literally projecting the progress of the war and showing Americans how close it is to home. I'm Jerry Broughton. Welcome to What's Your Map? An Oculi Mundi exploration. In this podcast, we hear from those who live and love maps, making, preserving, interpreting, and being inspired by them. In each episode, we ask our guests to unfold a map that is special to them and to tell us the stories that lie behind it. To follow the map as we talk about it, go to oculi-mundi.com. The history of the United States would be incomplete without the maps that helped build it. My guest today is a historian whose career has been dedicated to studying those maps and the cartographers who made America. Susan Schulten is the Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Denver and the author of A History of America in 100 Maps. Awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010, Susan's work spans American history, from the European discovery of the country, past Prohibition and through to the current digital age. She's currently a member of the Colorado State Historians Council and will be the state historian from 2025 to 2026. Susan, welcome to What's Your Map? Tell me about the map that we're looking at today.
The map that we're focusing on is one that was issued a full year before the United States entered World War II, and yet it was sort of urging Americans to think of the crises in Europe and Asia not as peripheral to us, separated by oceans, but actually in our back door. There's a really innovative image that appeared in Fortune in September of 1940. The cartographer is a man named Richard Edes Harrison, whose life pretty much spanned the 20th century. And he was particularly important as the United States experienced the 1930s, watched the rise of fascism in Asia and Europe. And so what you see here are three approaches to the United States from Europe, from Asia, from South America, essentially trying to shake Americans out of what Harrison called a cartographic lethargy, right? That this marriage that Americans had to isolationism, which had sort of been entrenched in his view by looking at the world through a Mercator projection, a traditional view.
This is very different. So what we're looking at is almost like three half-globe shells on top of each other as these three approaches to the US. One, the top is from Berlin, then beneath that, the second one from Tokyo, and then from Caracas. And you mentioned this, cartographic lethargy of breaking up a certain way of thinking about the world. And boy, does this do it, because it's very unfamiliar when you first look at it. Even the orientation is completely different, isn't it?
It is, and part of the goal he had from the get-go, even when he was just beginning to transition from art and architecture and design to map making, he thought the greatest threat to American geographical sense was this idea that north is up. He said that's something that has been entrenched over time, and what it's done is to create a kind of brittleness. What we need to do is to get back to the globe. What Harrison is giving us here is a view in the Great Circle route, an aviation route from Berlin into the United States through Newfoundland. So think of the far northeast corner of North America. We're reversing that and going into the continent toward the southwest. So you can see the Great Lakes in the foreground. You can see the mountain chains of the Rockies to your right. And this exaggerated curve of the horizon is sort of trying to pull you into the landscape and give you a sense of North America, primarily from the angle of vision. In Map 10, we're seeing the route from Tokyo into North America from the northwest. So the Rockies are in the foreground there. You can see the mountain chain in a perspective that most Americans were not familiar with. It takes you a minute, but once you see Denver smack dab in the middle and the Gulf of Mexico beyond it, you realize that you're moving into the southeast. Map 11 shows us a perspective from an imaginary point in the northern end of South America into the Gulf of Mexico and the southeastern United States. So you see the drainage system of the Mississippi flowing into New Orleans, and the Gulf is in the foreground, a perspective that showcases the Caribbean and the complexity of the Caribbean as sort of a neighbor of the United States. And you can really get a sense of the integral relationship between all aspects of North America, Central America moving up into Mexico, and then the United States.
The first map, it's map 9, it says from Berlin. And it says a great circle route from Berlin here passes through Detroit. The fanciful conceive, they wish, a pincer's movement extending from Newfoundland down the New England coast and down the St. Lawrence to the continent's heart. So this is a sense of this would be a corridor of invasion from Berlin, from Germany.
Try not to take it too literally. What he's trying to convey here is that this is a war that A, is global, a scale on which Americans, the world, had never seen, a war that is truly international on every continent. But B, perhaps more importantly, is that we're reckoning with this new technology, aviation. And aviation is going to really obliterate traditional understandings of distance and time. This view from Berlin is tried to convey this great circle route into Detroit, into what many people considered the heartland, right? Something that's quite distant, quite invulnerable. The point being that even the heartland of America, of North America, right, is reachable in ways that Americans really haven't reckoned with and comprehended.
Susan, I'm really struck by the third map that we have, which is labeled from Caracas, which says if an enemy should ever establish himself on the northern shore of South America or in the mazes of the West Indies, the language is fascinating. He, and it's very gendered, would cut first at the U.S. G-string, the canal, then rip at its soft belly here displayed. I mean, this is extraordinary language, of a sort of military colonial violation. But also, it strikes me as the most surprising of the three maps. What is this keying into around anxieties at this point, Susan?
I think there's a couple things going on. And the language, I knew you would notice that, Jerry. We don't always know who's entirely responsible. Sometimes Harrison's editors wrote some of the copy. Sometimes he wrote it, and he was a very cheeky writer, so I could see him writing some of that. The idea is, like you said, to very much visualize this, the soft underbelly. He uses that phrase in reference to Southern Europe as well. But here, that the Gulf is actually a point of access. And if Germany were to establish a kind of beachhead or redoubt, the northern edge of South America, it's not that far. The Gulf is something we need to pay attention to. And the last thing I'll point out to you here, because this is his signature style, is the way that so much is stripped off the map, if you notice, right? Look at all the detail that's gone so that you can see just what he wants you to see. Terrain. There's no key or legend, right? You know that that's the Rocky Mountains. Rivers, you can see by the width of his pen. And then taking off all except what he considers to be important reference points of location.
Can you give me a sense of his politics in relation to his mapping? Because is there a way in which Henry Luce is shaping what he wants around a challenge to the political and military isolationism that's predominant in the US at this time? Or where does Edes Harrison stand with that? Who influences the other? Can you unpick that a little bit?
That's a fantastic question. And I've spent a lot of time really tracing Luce's politics, his staff's politics at Fortune and Time. Henry Luce is best known to Americans as the founder of three of the most influential magazines of the 20th century, Time, Fortune, and Life magazines. Fortune was a magazine dedicated to celebrating and analyzing American business and industry, and that became the venue that allowed Harrison to experiment with full-color centerfold maps with very unorthodox perspectives. You point to something that I think is really nuanced, and that is it's a relationship and a dialogue between Harrison and his editors. Luce, of course, is a fan of capitalism. He's a very liberal orientation. He very much believes in a kind of philanthropic tradition. So it's not unbridled capitalism, but he does believe that free markets are quite powerful. And the internationalism that Fortune magazine expresses at this time is, just as you said, coming out of Luce's belief that free peoples around the world, right, must be defended. And that's also the angle at which they come to Lend-Lease, that's a policy they can support because it aligns in some ways with the opening of markets around the world. And that happens to line up against fascism.
Can you just explain that wider context of what people like Henry Luce are thinking around a bit of a pushback against the isolationism of the US at that point and Lend-Lease? Lend-Lease is a really, really significant issue, isn't it?
It is. And there's an important history here all through the 30s. The United States, particularly through Congress, is experiencing the sense that they were dragged into World War I. There's never really any proof that it was munitions manufacturers that were behind this, but the sentiment is there.
I didn't realize that, Susan. I had no idea that was a debate.
Oh,
this is extraordinary.
Absolutely, yes. The most important contextual piece of this is the book that was published in the early 30s titled Merchants of Death. And to make a long story short, it's essentially arguing that munitions manufacturers had a pretty heavy hand in pressuring or inviting the United States to enter World War I. And it aligns with a sense among Americans that this question of what was the war fought for? This wasn't our fight. Europe seems to be moving back into a crisis mode. And so the aversion to that fuels, I think, a sense of isolation. In Congress, every few years, the United States Congress is passing what are come to be known as neutrality acts. And what they're doing is hemming in the president's power further and further. And by the time we get to 1939, it's so constricted that the president really has no latitude. But then with the Nazi invasion of the Low Countries in Western Europe, we are in a crisis situation where Churchill and Britain are the only people standing up in Western Europe against Hitler. It's the last man standing. And the desperation that's involved here is really hard to overestimate. Churchill pleads with the United States for some kind of aid, give us the tools and we will finish the job. And to his credit, President Roosevelt takes up the mantle and all through the fall of 1940 begins to argue for a widened latitude to give munitions and goods to Europe without expectation of repayment in the near future. This map fuels that argument by trying to remind Americans that there is nothing distant about the Asian and European crises here. And so Lend-Lease becomes a rallying cry, if you will, for those internationalists who believe we have an obligation to aid Europe.
It's amazing to see how strong and compelling a map can be in illustrating the implications of war and geopolitics. But before we hear more from Susan, I'd love for you to take a moment to subscribe to this podcast and explore the other episodes. If you're interested in military history or maps as propaganda, check out Ed Parsons of Google, telling us about a 17th century royalist map, or Peter Barber, explaining a 16th century heart-shaped map created during the Reformation. You can find all the maps online at oculi-mundi.com. In a way, you could see these maps as being successful in some ways, or they certainly anticipate a sort of movement to engage with the wider global conflict. And you have a fascinating other example of where Edes Harrison is also picking up on this, a slightly later map. This is in 1941. The World Divided, this extraordinary map that he creates from a North Polar projection And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about this, because it's a particularly striking map. Again, very unusual, taken from a different perspective, a polar projection, but really cementing those political and military divisions by 1941.
As you said, it's a polar projection. And for those who aren't familiar with the language, it is simply a world map centered on the North Pole. These have a long history, as you know. It's Harrison who brings them back into journalistic use with one that he creates in 1936 of Pan Am and World Airways, so aviation routes around the world. So he's quite proud that here in 1941, he is showing Americans the state of the crisis a few months into Lend-Lease. So what you have is a color scheme that's helping Americans visually associate the different alignments around the world, with also Lend-Lease lines, the thickness of which corresponds to the depth of commitment. So you can see that very thick line going from the eastern shore of North America over to Britain.
It is a fabulous...
Oh, go ahead, please.
No, I mean, it is. I'm just looking at how extraordinary it is. When you look at it, what you see is the Axis black colours, with a presumption that Russia is also part of a general sort of anti-American position. And it's a weird melding also, isn't it, of European imperial power, because a lot of that orangey red that's, as it were, the Axis is also part of the British Empire.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we get a little advantage there, right? a little help with sheer mass. But something that you noticed straight away was the dark color that blends the Soviet Union together with Nazi Germany. Of course, this is right at the moment when the Soviet Union invades the USSR, ending the Nazi-Soviet pact. And so pretty quickly that color is going to shift. But part of Harrison's point is that this is a map that vastly distorts the Southern Hemisphere. He understands that. And he says it's okay. Because for this purpose, 90% of what we're talking about in terms of the belligerents in this war are operating within a tight circle around the North Pole. And for that reason, a map like this shouldn't supplant the Mercator projection, but why not put it alongside the Mercator projection, along with several others? He never wanted to champion one at the exclusion of the other. What he was looking for was an ability for Americans to shift between these projections to give themselves a much more powerful understanding of world relationships.
Tell me a little bit about Edes Harrison, because he's an interesting figure. You've been mentioning a little bit about the way in which he's uniting so many different styles of design, of art, of science in effect, and he doesn't really see himself as a cartographer, does he? Just give me a sense of his background, Susan.
Yes.
Where he comes from, because this is so distinctive.
It is. It's unusual. He's born right at the turn of the century. He's born into a learned family. His father is a very, very prominent scientist, first at Johns Hopkins, and then he moves to Yale. And so Harrison is born in Baltimore, but raised in New Haven. And really that world of Yale, particularly the world of the zoology and biology departments, is his world as an undergraduate. And no sooner is he at Yale than he starts to make pocket money by drawing biology illustrations for his dad's colleagues' textbooks. And this may sound like a small thing, but he is cutting his teeth really early on scientific illustration. He decides to pursue architecture and goes back to the Yale School of Fine Arts. And the thing that is to me most powerful about that is that architecture at Yale remained in the School of Fine Arts for a long time. That's important because it was taught alongside painting and sculpture, whereas architecture at other places was really housed in surveying or engineering. That ability to play with style, to keep style in his maps, would remain with him throughout his career.
And I think you say about he falls into it accidentally, doesn't he? It's purely circumstantial. What happens? How does he end up making these maps?
Well, that's sort of my favorite part, because for all this wonderful training, whether it's in New York City or at the Yale School of Fine Arts, he has this fancy degree. He graduates at the very moment that the market crashes. and America is roiled by a depression. One of the first industries to get hit by the depression, of course, is construction. So there's not a lot of use for a very young, newly minted architect in New York City. But he also takes work where he can. So he works at a design firm. And then a female platonic friend of his calls him in New York and says, you got to help me out. She works at Time as a researcher. She says, my map maker didn't show up. Can you substitute? And at the last minute, he draws a map of the October 1932 predictions for the presidential election in November. That's the first formal map that he makes for Time. He starts making maps for Time, and then they take him upstairs and interview him for the Fortune job, which is a new magazine. He says, even though he had a lot of prickly relationships with his editors at Fortune, he is absolutely clear that the latitude they gave him, the artistic freedom, was the greatest boon to his career because they let him try things like this that you're looking at. And they ran them. Some they didn't run, but most of them they did run.
And we have this unique situation, Susan Schulten, that you met the map maker. I wonder if you could just tell me a bit about that, because you met him, I think, as a student, and he immediately responded and said, I'm not a cartographer, I'm an artist. I think this is wonderful for the series that we get, somebody who can deal with the cartographer and have the interview. Tell me about that. What happened?
Well, in the early 1990s, I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, writing a dissertation that had to do with the way Americans were taught to see the world through geography. I knew that I wanted Harrison to be part of that. I had stumbled on his work, and I knew that that might be a really powerful endpoint given his influence. And I was doing that atlas research at the Library of Congress in the Geography and Map Division. It's the largest collection of maps in North America. And when I was there, the curators, when they knew I was interested in Harrison, they were in the process of getting his papers. And they said, you have to go talk to him. He's in Manhattan, write him a letter. Here's his address. Jerry, this is long before the internet. And so it was, in fact, a letter.
Don't we remember?
That's right. I don't even think he had a phone, as I recall, but I wrote him a letter, and he wrote me right back. And I took the train up to New York. I was so excited. And I sat and spent the day with him. And he was toward the end of his life. He spoke through a voice box. Yeah. He was incredibly articulate. He was completely coherent. And he was surrounded by his maps and notes and clippings. It was obvious to me how proud he was of his legacy. And to your point, we spent hours talking about his maps. And then at the end, I said, tell me what you think your greatest legacy is as a cartographer. And he banged his fist on the table and said to me, I am an artist. And that really stayed with me. It's not that he didn't consider himself to have cartographic expertise. And of course, he used that term. He was very close to many professional cartographers and geographers. He deeply valued those relationships. But he was clear that his orientation and his experience as an artist is partly what made him successful. And the last thing I'll say on that is that the more I research him, the more I realize that he was one, and perhaps the most prominent, but one of a community of individuals that were set apart in journalism, in part because they had backgrounds in art and scientific illustration, that gave them an ability to sort of step away from surveying, fidelity to projection, perhaps, precision, to try to tell a story. And I think that's what Harrison's legacy is that the maps are necessarily argumentative, they necessarily carry a narrative, and that's what the viewer is left with.
I think that's a very beautiful way of thinking about how the map makers throughout history have always questioned or challenged the sense of what it is to be a map maker. I'm a historian, I'm a scientist, I'm an artist. It covers so many, because in a way, as we know, you're really a historian working in maps. I work in literature across maps, and the map makers themselves accidentally come into this story. It's a wonderfully serendipitous story because, as you and I know, cartography doesn't really necessarily have an academic home, and it's all these flotsam and jetsam of people who accidentally end up doing this work. And as you say, there's something about Edes Harrison. Everything comes together at that moment to create these extraordinary maps which are so defining, I think, of that moment. I mean, for you, for a historian, surely that's what's so exciting, isn't it? That you capture a moment of politics in such flux around American debates about to engage, to not engage, what's going on at that moment, 40, 41, 42. And these maps somehow just encapsulate all those debates.
Yeah, they're wonderful little windows, aren't they? I mean, that I think of them as windows or portals onto a moment. I mentioned that anecdote to Ralph Ehrenberg, who was the former chief of the Geography and Map Division and a really wonderful scholar and archivist. I told him that Harrison had reminded me he was an artist first. And Ralph Ehrenberg reminded me that that's in a way a return to tradition. In other words, that we sometimes determine the degree to which cartography is a science, right? That's really very, very recent. But that he reminded me that many of the, great map makers of the 18th and early 19th century in the United States were men coming out of artistic traditions who were skilled draftsmen in the field. And that's something worth sort of reminding ourselves.
And I'd like to then ask you just quickly about your own career, because in terms of talking about movements across those different disciplines and forms of responsibility, you have this role as a state historian. And I can't help but think how interesting that is in a current moment where America is obviously, let's just say, going through various sort of upheavals in terms of how it sees itself politically, both internally and within a wider world. And the Edes Harrison moment is capturing something similar about trying to understand where America is, what its direction is. And we don't want to get into anything granular around politics, but I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that, because I'm so struck by you taking on that role of a state historian and what those responsibilities are, because we as academics don't often do that, Susan. And I think it's wonderful that you're doing that. And I wonder what the responsibilities and the excitements, but also the challenges are for you in terms of taking that role.
Well, it's interesting. It's a pro bono position. In other words, I am employed as a professor at the University of Denver, and my bread and butter are students. But I was invited to take on this position for the next academic year because there are two very interesting anniversaries this year. One is that it is the 150th anniversary of Colorado statehood. We are the centennial state, 1876. And it is also what your listeners might be more familiar with, the 250th anniversary of American independence. So some of the things we're trying to do are mount exhibits that, for instance, the one I'm most excited about is looking at turning points in American history. But as you say, it's a very fraught time, and I've certainly experienced that just as an American citizen. The thing I am most hopeful about, and I might be just terribly naive, but I have never found in my 30 years of teaching that students want anything but a complicated and messy story. In other words, they seem hungry to know that people are good and bad, and there were advantages and disadvantages to any decisions that were made, that World War II was simultaneously the end of fascism at that moment and the onset of the Cold War, that these two things can't be extricated. And so my goal and my thrust has always been to show people a complicated story. And I think, like you, I like to do it with maps because it doesn't just take the focus off me, but it gives people something interesting to look at that we can kind of journey through together. And I think if you take that assumption that we can do this together and that it's complicated and hard, that's a pretty disarming way to engage the public and bring them with you.
That's a very understated way of putting it, Susan. And really, I'd just like to end by making a comment, which I am very pleased that you came on the show, because people should know that as far as I'm concerned, there's nobody explaining contemporary American history more brilliantly through maps than the work that you've done and continue to do. So in a way, it doesn't surprise me that you're taking on that sort of civic role. So it's just been wonderful to speak to you, and thank you so much for joining me on What's Your Map, Susan Schulten.
Oh, thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure.
The works created by Richard Edes Harrison are a great example of how powerful maps can be. Harrison's point about how globalized and interconnected the world is still feels relevant 80 years later. I'm Jerry Broughton. Thank you so much for listening. This has been an Oculi Mundi exploration. The producer is Jill Achineku, and it's a Whistledown production. Oculi Mundi is the online home of the Sunderland collection of antique maps and atlases. You can read more about the collection, see the maps from this podcast, and send suggestions for future maps at oculi-mundi.com.